Hello, everyone, and welcome to
Tracing Text
with Anton.
and Sylvia.
And today we have our fifth podcast, which is going to be dealing with one of the writers that Sylvia wants to present and that she enjoys reading and writing about. Sylvia, could you tell us who it is?
I guess the title for our today's podcast is "The Femme Fatale's Path" in Amparo Dávila's short story "La Celda." In podcast 3, we discussed what the femme fatale was in very general terms, really not focusing on Latin American literature or Spanish literature. So I'm going to do a brief recap, and then I'll talk about the author and this short story that has a character that could be considered a femme fatale.
And of course, our listeners can always go back and listen to that third podcast, which is available on Podomatic
and
iTunes, and also on YouTube. So
exactly.
There's many ways to listen to Tracing Text. So let's refresh our memory about what the femme fatale is.
Well, as I mentioned before, the femme fatale is a French term, and it literally means fatal woman. And generally, we can think of the femme fatale as beautiful, mysterious, and aloof, and yet her seeming frigidity is coupled with a sensuousness and erotic appeal that leads to man's downfall.
And that's where the fatale part
right,
comes
exactly.
in.
And there are so many examples, in literature and also in oral tales. This is not simply just written text, but of course we have some from classical mythology and biblical sources. So we see many, many examples that we can draw from. And in this podcast, we're going to focus specifically on the author Amparo Dávila and her short story La Celda. And I'm going to be looking at some of the psychological aspects that are worked into the story with respect to the femme fatale.
And so maybe our listeners are or are not familiar with the biography of Amparo Dávila, who was from Mexico. Could you tell us, or is from Mexico?
Well, she's from Mexico, but
more?
She is a poet and short story writer primarily, and she was born February 21st, 1928, in Pino, Zacatecas, in Mexico, Zacatecas. Her debut collection of short stories is entitled Tiempo Destrozado, which could be translated as Shattered Time, and it was published in 1959.
So she was about 31 when she started publishing.
And then she has another collection called Música Concreta, so concrete music, and that came out in 1964. And then her last compilation of short prose is Árboles Petrificados, or Petrified Trees, and that was published in 1977. Originally, Árboles Petrificados was published by the publishing house Joaquín Moritz, and it garnered immediate recognition with a very famous prize called Premio Javier Villarrutia that same year. In 2001, the aforementioned prize they did another redistribution from the publishing house Planeta.
Which is one of the most important in the Spanish-speaking world.
Exactly. Both Tiempo Destrozado and Música Concreta were put into a single volume called Muerte en el Bosque, or Death in the Forest, in 1985 by Lecturas Mexicanas. And she has other collections of poetry, for example, Salmos Bajo la Luna, 1950, Perfil de Soledades, 1954, and Meditaciones a la Orilla del Sueño, 1954.
And some of her work has been translated into English
Right,
as well.
And she's still writing, so this is just a brief overview of some of her more important work.
Now, one of the things that you have mentioned to me about Dávila's writing style is that she has what you call a Gothic sensibility. What does that mean exactly?
Well, she generally has themes that have to do with mental alienation, and she submerges the reader in a world that defies rational explanation. So there's an element of, the supernatural as well, and it has it's kind of dark in nature. And then, but when she writes, it's not just simply this Gothic sensibility. She definitely engages in a feminist critique of women's roles in society. A lot of her stories have to do with repressed feminine sexuality and madness, and is a common motif that we see in her stories, for example.
And so this is something that we will see also in La Celda.
Right, which means the cell. So as I mentioned before, it's part of the collection, La Celda from Tiempo Destrozado. And the story is mostly, except for the very end, presented from an omniscient point of view. And our central character in the story is Maria Camino. And basically, it's a short story, but it presents a decisive point in her life, in the protagonist's life. What is interesting about Maria Camino is Camino means road or path. So there's a little bit of a symbolic significance with respect to her name. The problem in the story is the fact that there's a supposed presence in her room that is called él, or he, that kind of haunts her at night.
And that's where the Gothic comes in.
Right. And she doesn't sleep. She's always tired because of this presence that's in her room.
Is this a he that she can see or just sense?
Sense, but as a reader, we don't know that because it's presented in such a way so that when it's narrated, it's when she is with others, with her family downstairs, or with friends when she's socializing. So we don't know really if it's a physical presence, if it's in her mind. So there's a lot of ambiguity in that sense.
Certain suspense as well.
Right, exactly. And basically, this causes her to feel ill, like she has un malestar, or malady, because of her inability to sleep because of this haunting presence. But at the same time, they don't give her age, but she's probably in her late teens, maybe early 20s, and the goal of her mother, who is a widow, is to marry her, and get her married and have a good match to a successful husband.
So thinking that would bring about the end of this malady or this problem.
Part of it is to end the malady, but part of it is simply following the order of a bourgeois order of marrying well, and the typical course of events for a young woman who, from the reading we gather, is of a middle class in terms of if we were thinking about social class. So the mother wants her to have a favorable marriage.
So does this marriage actually occur or not?
Well, she does. She is engaged to Jose Juan Olaguibel, who is one of the minor characters, and he and his cousin often go to her house by her mother's invitation, to play like card games, parlor games, and they form part of the same social circle. She is engaged, and part of the story has to do with some of the preparations leading up to the wedding. So the mother is very happy that, in fact, she is engaged to a man who's seemingly successful.
Mm-hmm. But it seems that perhaps that marriage was not meant to be.
Well, no, because ultimately, and this is a spoiler alert, but I think one reads the story not so much for like what's going to happen, but how it unravels, but rather, basically, she murders her fiancé.
And this is where the idea of the femme fatale could come in.
Right.
But from the very beginning of your explanation of what the story was about, it seemed more like she was a victim more than she was the person who was going to become the actor and kill or ensnare somebody. Right?
Right. So I think that's how Dávila presents or critiques the social structure of the time, because in many ways we could say that she's a victim, and that she is finding a way to rebel, and not follow that same path or paradigm that is already set for her. She doesn't want to follow that. So there are clues at the very beginning of the story that tell us that somehow, besides the haunting presence in her room, that she's different in some way from a typical young woman. One of the scenes that is interesting to me is when she walks, goes downstairs and enters, I think it's the dining room if I'm not mistaken, and her mother and her sister, Clara, when they observe her, they look at her very critically, because they see that she doesn't look well. She looks pale, she has bags under her eyes, and of course, for a young woman who needs to have a favorable marriage, this is definitely not to her best interest. So there's a sense of her being observed very critically, and you can sense that she feels a discomfort with that.
Within her own family.
Within her own family. But when she does this, there's a scene where she grabs an apple and she bites that apple, which of course that's kind of a very, typical symbol, like the apple. It's not something that, you have to dig very deep to get that allusion. So we see that allusion to the biblical Eve biting an apple. And since Amparo Dávila's stories and the trajectory of her work has to do with repressed feminine sexuality, we can make that connection in that instant. And there are some things that can suggest that repression, because from a psychological point of view, this haunting presence could be something that she yearns for, but she doesn't have or will never have as a good daughter and then maybe a good wife, potentially.
Mm-hmm. You're listening to the Trace and Text podcast with Anton
and Sylvia,
coming to you from deep in the heart of the state of Tennessee, and we're talking about Amparo Dávila's short story La Celda, which means the cell. And Sylvia's telling us a little bit about the figure of the Femme Fatale within this story. If I were to ask you, Sylvia, would you characterize her as a femme fatale? And when I say her, I mean the character, the main character in the story, as femme fatale in the typical sense of the word, or has this become? Is this a different use of the element of the concept of the femme fatale within this story by Dávila?
I think if you look at it very superficially, she could be perceived as a typical femme fatale because, in fact, she murders her fiancé. But I think that the point or the goal of the author or the narrator is not to focus on the death of Jose Juan, but rather to look at what happens to her at the end, which she ends up being in a cell. And we don't know what kind of cell that is. So I think that in that way, it's very subtle, but I think that there's a slight, it upsets kind of the archetype of the femme fatale to a certain degree. It's not very overt. There isn't like this feminist discourse that's very, kind of upfront and it's very clear. It's subtle. And I think that subtlety is what makes it interesting. And of course, when she writes this, which is in the 50s, it kind of, destabilizes, the social order in some ways. So I think that it isn't your typical femme fatale, to answer your question. I mean, other people could argue against it, but I think that there is a subtle element of subverting that archetype.
Now, the title of the story is The Cell. What is the importance of the cell within this story? Or, in other words, why is the title of this story The Cell, in your opinion?
Well, clearly, the cell, of course, is where she ends up at the end. We don't know if this is a cell in a prison, in a psychiatric ward, which very possibly it is, or if it's even in her own mind, because there is so much ambiguity in the story. So that is one cell, but the cell itself could be the entire way that her life is framed from the beginning. There's a set script that she has to follow. So in a sense, she has been locked up all her life because of the way her life is. And if she marries, it would still follow that same pattern. So regardless of whether she had or had not killed Jose Juan, I think the title is very important in creating or telling us that she has been confined to a certain role for her whole life as a woman.
Now, since the story was written in the 1950s, and this comes at the height of the fame or the moment in history when psychoanalytical criticism was probably around the heyday of that approach. What can be gained from looking at this story from a psychoanalytical perspective, or is that the main perspective through which you see this story?
I do see it very much through a psychoanalytic perspective because, of course, we can, as a kind of a gothic story, we can see some of those elements, but we can also look at it and see that she is suffering some sort of delusion or hallucinations or something. But if we go back to maybe some of the feminist psychoanalysts, like Julia Kristeva is a famous one, and her idea of the abject. And the abject is everything that is not only considered other, or in other words, you have subject and object, but it's everything that is discarded and seen as, how can I word this? Maybe, like repulsive
Mm-hmm.
or dirty, or so it can be both metaphoric and literal. So she really developed this idea of the abject, and in many ways, the way that she, the function or what happens, there is a lot of elements of the abject within the story, I would say.
So you wouldn't think that there is any chance that Maria Camino would follow the pathway in her life of conforming to the role that society would expect of a woman her age at that time?
No, because there, like I said, from the, and I think that I focus a lot on that scene where she bites into the apple. I think that, from there's a lot of things that the writer does to produce kind of like the whole, the phonosemantics, which is a part of linguistic theory that is sometimes questioned by serious linguists, because what that says is that sounds in and of themselves carry a certain symbolic meaning. And in the story, I think it's interesting the way that there are many words that have M's and N's, which are nasal, but also suggest things like not only eating, but also things that are malevolent or monstrous. So that ties it in to that idea of the abject, or that to a certain degree. I don't know if that explains it in some way.
Now, you've mentioned this moment in the story where she bites into the apple. Just set that scene for us. Why is she doing this within the plot of the story?
Well, like I mentioned, it's to avoid the critical glance of her sister Clara and her mother. But it also suggests, what that scene suggests is not only that she is a femme fatale like Eve, but that she has a a sexual appetite, which she has to repress. So it's that idea of repression. And that would be the psychoanalytical aspect. And I think that that's how the text presents this particular scene. So that is the part that is important, and kind of her budding sexuality at that point as a young woman.
You're listening to the Tracing Text podcast with Anton
And Sylvia.
and we're talking about the Mexican writer Amparo Dávila today, and particularly about this short story, La Celda, or the Cell. And I guess the idea of sexuality is an important part of this story. Is this a constant in the work of Amparo Dávila, or not so much?
There is. Not all of the stories deal with sexuality, but many of them do. A lot of them have to do just with death. But even so, there's always a tie between death and sexuality. That's always the case if we look at it from a psychoanalytical
and which
point
is
of view,
also
like
very
the
much a
death
part
drive
of Gothic literature
Right.
in many ways.
So death is I would say is a pretty constant element in her stories, and I've read many of them. I can't remember every single one, so I can't say that all 100%. But I would say that it's a constant element, and there is always that kind of there is a sense of sexual repression in many of those stories. And I think the one that is more famous than La Celda is called El Huésped, which is
The guest.
The
right?
guest. And again, we don't know who this guest is. And it's frightening, but at the same time, there's some sort of attraction as well.
It's
So-
also a male guest in
right.
this case, because
Yeah,
it says
because
El
it's
Huésped.
Huésped,
Right?
exactly. So just like here, it's El, so we know that it's not just a presence, but it's a masculine presence in the story that either she wants, she desires. So there's that for sure in as an undercurrent.
When you decided to talk about this particular story, what is it about this particular story, Sylvia, that seems to haunt you, the way that El or he haunts Maria in
Just like you
in
asked
the
me about
story?
whether I'm a Femme Fatale, now it's like, what haunts me?
Well, if you're talking about the Femme Fatale, obviously there's going to be a certain haunting quality
Right.
to this, because Femme Fatales in many ways are haunting themselves, otherwise they
Right.
wouldn't work as Femme Fatale.
I think it's the ending, which is where she ends up, is very, I think critics could argue, like, is this something positive at the end or negative at the end? And that is the part that kind of like drives me a little bit crazy, because we don't know, and we have to decide as a reader, because it could all be in her mind. Even, in fact, even the murder could very well be imaginary. I mean, there's no, because there's a shift in how the text is narrated from omniscient to first person, her voice at the very end. So we don't know with absolute certainty as to the outcome. But even though she is in this cell at the end, she manages to avoid marriage, which for her seemed to be a worse fate.
So being in a cell, whichever cell it is, for her, is more positive than being married off to somebody she doesn't love.
It seems because she didn't love him. When she's engaged, there's a scene where he tells her he's going to be away for a while because he has a business trip to New York, and she's just thrilled. She's happy.
Ecstatic
And then
about that.
when this trip kind of falls through, and he tells her he's not going to New York after all, which for, if you're engaged and, you have in love, that would be good news. In fact, she's enraged by the fact that he's around. So she clearly is not in love with him, and she really has this inner rage. Although she doesn't show it, she seems very calm most of the time, although very aloof as well. She's not very engaged either socially, nor does she participate in the domestic activities that a woman or girl of her age would do, like just household chores and then wedding preparations. Nothing seems to really interest her except for that haunting presence. That's what, you know, occupies her mind.
So that's what she does all day. In other words, she's not really productive throughout the day
she's
because of this presence.
Right. And so there's a sense that she fears it, but then the way it's presented, it's almost, she longs for it. She wants to go back every
As though
night.
that were the only thing she has.
Right, that's what she has.
Now, it seems like there is a very negative presentation of the idea of marriage in this story, or at least of the social function of the institution of marriage within the story. Now, is there any indication that you have found that maybe this had to do with the biography of the writer herself or not? Because
No.
it's an interesting thing to me to see, you know, that she is presenting these characters that are haunted, not just in the case of La Celda, but also El Huésped, or the guest, you know. So I'm wondering if there is any connection to her real life and this rejection of marriage as a possibility for women at this time.
I couldn't really answer that question. I don't have enough information about her biography to say that her rejection of marriage has to do with her own events.
And it doesn't really have to,
right?
Really,
but I can say that and I wasn't going to mention it so much in this podcast because I thought we'd go off on a tangent. But it is interesting in the story that her mother, remember I mentioned she's a widow. There, in many ways, she is quite. There are certain phallic elements or things that she does, like she smokes a pipe, which a pipe is never just a pipe.
That's right, it's not a pipe.
So, and she.
I wouldn't know. I
has,
don't smoke a pipe. So
okay.
I wouldn't know if it is.
You
or
wouldn't
not.
know. But although her mother wants to kind of inscribe her within this very, have her follow a traditional path. In fact, the mother is quite independent and very strong-willed. So, which could be seen as something feminist, although, in my opinion, she's those masculine sort of traits which are hinted at could be simply just following a patriarchal order. So I'm not convinced that the mother is independent in a feminist sort of way per se. So that's something that could be looked at, but I do see that perhaps that's also a reason that she wants to reject marriage. She sees her mother perhaps being strong and independent without having a man. So that could be a reason for her rejection as well.
There doesn't seem to be very much of a masculine or male presence in the story, other than this
haunting presence. And then her fiancé, Jose Juan, he doesn't really, except when they socialize, they're still not engaged. They just come over and it seems like they play games, like parlor games and hang out, typical, very kind of, it's not very exciting at all. And we don't really hear from him. So it's
you very tellingly described him at the beginning of the episode as a minor character.
Yeah, he's a
minor. And you would think that if it's the fiancé, and then he is murdered, he would be a more important character. Right,
but he doesn't have a central role in the sense of how the events unravel. She's the one controlling what's happening because of the choices that she's making.
You're listening to the Tracing Text podcast with Anton
and Sylvia.
And Sylvia's talking mostly today, and she's talking about one of the stories by Amparo Dávila that she really likes, La Celda, or The Cell. And before we close the program, I would like to ask you if there's anything in particular that we haven't touched upon that you would like to mention about the story. Just to make sure that you really have worked on this. You've done a great job putting together the script or the outline for this episode. So, is there anything in particular that we may not have talked about that you'd like to raise?
Well, one thing, she's always, in some ways, she's not described very well in terms of like what are her traits. Is she a brunette? Is she a blonde? Does she have brown eyes? We don't know that. Mm-hmm. In some ways, that is left out, except for the fact that they always mention her pallor, because she's not sleeping well at night.
And that's another Gothic feature.
That's another Gothic feature. But at the end of this story, when she does murder the fiancé, and it is at a New Year's Eve dinner hosted by her mother, she's wearing this Italian brocade gown, like a kind of a tunic. And although that seems to symbolize virginity, purity, a submissive nature. In fact, when I did some research on the Femme Fatale, Valerie Steele and Jennifer Park in Gothic Dark Glamour, that's a whole book on the Gothic and so on, white was actually the traditional color associated with vampires, especially women. Mm-hmm. So there's also there's a slight vampiric element in that. So it's that whiteness has nothing to do with her, kind of docile nature. Mm-hmm. It's more to do with something that's malevolent mm-hmm. instead. So that's very interesting, and it's really focuses on that at the end, and as well as images having to do with the moon. And interestingly enough, if we think of Artemis or Diana, the goddess of the hunt, mm-hmm. she was the virgin goddess, did not want to have a man. She was independent. So that could also be kind of tied into that as well.
Now, why is it important that she chooses to kill this person, this fiancé, on New Year's Eve? Is there any sort
Perhaps it ends with the old, start with the new. I don't know. I mean, that's an interesting point. I guess the new year would mark like her marriage, her wedding is on the horizon, and she wants mm-hmm. to avoid that. And then when she describes the fiancé's death, it's completely cold, and there's no sentimentality. She doesn't have a sense of guilt. And once that description, when she ends with that and we see her in the cell, and she talks about being like a stupefied rag doll, hunting flies and spying on mice, that's her nightmarish reality, but mm-hmm. in no way does she ever feel any guilt for José Juan Olaguibel. So she's just determined. She just simply wants to not marry, and that's what she chooses to do instead of following her mother's wishes.
So ultimately, if I were to ask you, Sylvia, in your opinion, what do you think that Amparo Dávila is trying to do with this story, which seems to be very complex? If you just not the plot itself,
right?
But if you dig a little deep underneath the surface, if you go a little bit beyond just the plot, what do you think in your research and in your reading of this story? What do you think that the main point would be that this story is trying to make about women at that time in the 1950s, and also in that social class?
I think a lot of it just simply is sexual freedom, which they lack. Because marriage does not mean that there will be sexual fulfillment. And I think that the biggest thing that is the underlying, because as you say, the storyline is fairly simple and straightforward. but ultimately it is about being fulfilled. And I think that in her stories and in this story, that's definitely a thread. And it's not so much marriage per se, although in this case it works that way because of the way the plot unfolds.
Yeah.
But I think that it has to do with this desire to just not simply accept being a passive object, and rather having some subjectivity and having desires that are met. So I think that in that sense it's very much, and it's also right at the point, the late 50s before we get into the 60s, where we have a sexual revolution. So I think that it's kind of bubbling,
kind of prefiguring
that. And the character will do whatever it takes to a certain degree, although still in this story we see that there are still some consequences. And that's why the ending is sometimes problematic. How do we interpret it? Is it positive or negative?
Sounds to me like it could be a little bit akin to, the works of Sylvia Plath or the works of Virginia Woolf, maybe.
Right, because you think of a room of one's own. Well, she gets a cell of her own. And I think about that. And is her cell a better choice than being forced into an unhappy relationship? I don't know.
And that might be a rhetorical question.
Right. That's a rhetorical question. It's something to think about. I don't have the answer.
Amparo Dávila from Zacatecas, the state of Zacatecas in Mexico, and the story is The Cell, La Celda. Now, Sylvia, to finish, I would ask you, particularly for those of our listeners who might actually read in Spanish, might understand Spanish, might be able to read in Spanish, what would be one book that you would definitely recommend by Amparo Dávila? If you had to say just one book, this is the one, go for it.
It would be Tiempo Destrozado, or what we would, translate it as Shattered Time, because it has all of these short stories. El Huésped is a very famous one, very interesting, also very complex from a psychological point of view. And the stories are just very rich with these themes that, they're more than just the plot. They're definitely stories that leave you kind of with some questions, and they're not clear cut in the sense that there's a complete and utter resolution, but they're interesting to analyze.
It's not the kind of literature you would read if you would want to read something with a closed ending that very clearly closes
or a
everything.
happy ending. There is no set happy ending. It's not a Disney story.
Well, actually, when we were thinking about this episode, we had said on episode number 3 that we would do an introduction to the idea of the Femme Fatale, and now what you're doing is trying to
kind of
illustrate with examples from actual stories, actual novels, the idea of the Femme Fatale and the concept.
And I think here the concept is the way that I looked at it was very much a psychological point of view. Some of my other examples, which I hope to develop later, are going to look at other ways of looking at the Femme Fatale. But for this one, because of the nature of the character and this underlying presence, it just lends itself to be looked at from that perspective.
So in the near future, we should expect more episodes about the Femme Fatale here on Tracing Text.
That's one of my favorite topics. Maybe I have a Femme Fatale.
I don't know. I won't speak to that, but I'm glad that you're bringing this up, because it's a concept that I haven't really worked on very much. Although of course it's around us in the movies and literature, and of course in real life as well, maybe. But it's certainly something that it piques my interest, and I admit I haven't read these stories, but it gives me a chance to think about this, and maybe in the future, pick up the book and read the stories myself. Now, the next episode of Tracing Texts will not be about the Femme Fatale.
No, it's your turn, Anton.
We're going to be traveling back in time, not to the 1950s, but more like to the late 16th, early 17th century. And we're going to be talking about Miguel de Cervantes again. But in this case, we're not going to be talking about his most famous work, Don Quixote, not even about one of the exemplary novels that we've already talked about, but about one of his theater plays that was not incredibly popular when it first came out, but it has become an important work as you know, as the centuries unfolded. And I'm talking about La Numancia, which is actually one of the early plays that Cervantes wrote, and we're going to be talking specifically about the concept or the idea of religion within that really short but very interesting play, La Numancia by Miguel de Cervantes.
That'll be fascinating. I'm really looking forward to that.
Now, if the listeners out there who listen to us on Podomatic or iTunes or YouTube might be interested in getting in touch with us, Sylvia, what can they do?
Well, they can certainly email us, and that email address is tracingtext@gmail.com. That's tracingtexts@gmail.com.
And they could also leave comments, right, on the
Right,
iTunes and YouTube as
and
well.
actually any comment is welcome, whether positive or negative, or perhaps you have some ideas about works that you would like to hear about. We would definitely encourage you to post because it actually helps our ratings as well. So that's definitely a good thing.
Well, Sylvia, I appreciate your spending some time this afternoon here talking about Amparo Dávila and about the story of the cell, and I look forward to further installments of Tracing Text. Thank you also to everybody out there for listening and commenting and just reading this nice literature, interesting literature that you have brought today. I hope it has piqued the interest of the listeners out there.
Exactly.
And now, I think, unless it's...
That's it. I'm going to have to say goodbye.
I think it's time to say goodbye from Anton.
And Sylvia.
Signing off now from deep in the heart of the state of Tennessee. This has been...
Tracing Text.